Badass woman, U.S. Marine Corps veteran, and suicide survivor. I bet that got your attention as a title for this episode. Only the Strong Survive was recorded by Elvis Presley, the king himself, and others. And the song is about a young man who jilted by his sweetheart, and his mother is telling him to get up off his knees and hold his head high and get on with his life. Now, this advice happens to be the personal mantra of many who consider themselves strong and competitive, and yet reach a breaking point or a burnout point that indeed does bring them to their knees. In a bigger, better, faster, stronger, rat race competitive environment, the race to reach the top too often becomes a fall to the bottom. And too often, pride won't allow to speak and seek help, and the consequences are becoming increasingly fatal. Suicides in America last year were 44,000. To introduce today's episode, the life journey of my guest, DeAnn Wandler, thankfully has a different outcome, yet easily she could have been another statistic. Yet today she is on a mission to help others facing pressures they're finding unmanageable and unimaginable. And through her own inspiring story, reaching out to others with a message of hope, healing, and a regimen of recovery and self-care that will hopefully equip them with the resilience to persevere and manage their way through their own maze of overwhelming anxiety, stress, and depression. She is a passionate suicide prevention community advocate, speaker, and educator since attempting to take her own life by shooting herself in the head, and is focused on ensuring the voice of lived experience is heard and valued. Having this unusual lived life experience, DeAnn, a former university administrator, now works on promoting mental health and wellness in the community and workplace, as well as raising awareness on mental health support needs in the workplace. DeAnn hopes to remove stigma and promote open dialogue with top employers about mental health needs. She also aims to teach others how to take care of their mind and body again by giving support, education, inspiration, leadership, empowerment, and awareness to ensure they nourish themselves. She currently serves on the Mental Health and Recovery Counseling, Education, and Training National Advisory Committee, as well as the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. And is an active member of the Stark County Suicide Prevention Coalition. She's been trained in applied suicide intervention skills and mental health first aid. She's a certified brain-based coach through the Neuro Leadership Institute, is a narrative coach trained and certified in mindfulness, and is near completion of her registered yoga teacher training. Welcome, DeAnn, and many thanks for agreeing to be my guest today.
Hey, I am happy to be here, both literally and figuratively.
Yes, no, exactly. Well, let's talk about the larger macro issue before we delve more into your own personal story and some of your experiences since. As I mentioned, the suicide rate is at an unprecedented high, 44,000 alone in 2018. The deaths from stress-related, including alcohol, opioids, and suicide, equaled over 200,000 in the United States. This is really a mental health crisis that is unprecedented in our history. I know this is a complex issue, but what do you ascribe some of the causes to?
Yeah, Alan, that certainly is a very complex issue. I think there's several things that come into play. Part of it, first and foremost, is greater recognition of mental disorders among psychologists and psychiatrists. When the DSM was first published, the DSM meaning the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that's a mouthful. When that was first published in 1952, I believe, it listed approximately 106 mental disorders. By 1980, there were 265. 14 years later, the fourth edition actually expanded the list to 365. So first and foremost, when we talk about that, that means that mental illnesses, the recognition of it has been expanded exponentially. It's also been discovered that mental health problems may actually start earlier than previously thought. So, for example, recent studies now show that young children are more cognitively sophisticated, more emotionally sophisticated than we previously understood. And they have complex emotions and all of the prerequisites of what depressive symptoms are. So it stands to reason then that if left untreated, if they have a mental disorder or an illness and it's untreated in toddlers, that it can lead to more depression later in life, both as a youth or as a young adult or adulthood. Then I think when we also consider the issue of modern post-industrial society itself, which I actually think may be very well at the core of the mental health crisis. And I know we've talked about this before. So what I mean by that is our former nuclear family, that is no longer in place. Most people, on top of that, if we look at how we operate as a society today, let's think about this, for example, because I was one of these individuals. People wake up to an alarm long before they've had enough sleep, and they hurry through their morning routine. Many times they have a stressful commute to arrive on time to a job that more often than not they hate. And for those who are, because it's a podcast, they can't see me, I'm raising my hand. I was one of those individuals. My commute to my job in Washington, D.C. was anywhere between a 4 to a 5 hour daily commute. Even though I only lived 50 miles outside the city, when you talk about DC traffic, it was a 2 hour commute in and a 2 to 3 hour commute home. So they put in 8 hours or more at work, or more, yes, more than common is more, put up with rush hour traffic and arrive home exhausted with little energy to do more than have dinner, watch TV, and fall into bed. And then they wake up the next morning and do it all over again, like rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. Yet these efforts often fail to deliver financial security. American workers, when we look at their salaries and wages have been stagnant for years. And under the pressure of debts and financial obligations that are increasingly difficult to handle. So then let's go back to what I talked about with the nuclear family. That's the other part of the equation. This has changed for us in society. We have increasing isolation. As primates, humans are tribal clan creatures by nature. But in today's society, we have that increased isolation, both by virtually, there's nothing traditional about the so-called traditional nuclear family anymore. And then a lot of in the world of our increasing social media and technology, our social relationships have now become virtual. And they've been reduced to characters and hashtags. So when we consider that, the reality of today's teens and young adults are making their way in a world that's very different than what I was raised as a child, and even different from the ones that their parents or grandparents experienced. So, they're navigating constant developments in technology and in social media comparison, all while coping with an uncertain future. And that takes a toll on young people. And as a result, I think we're reaching record levels of mental health issues in today's society. But it gets even more complex. You and I have talked briefly as well about it's also being discovered that young children are being treated for mental health disorders that in fact their behavior really may be attributed to a food allergy. Take glucose, for example. I'm sorry, gluten is what I meant to say, gluten. With gluten, many children have had behavioral issues because of gluten intolerance, yet they're being treated for a mental health disorder. And when you treat someone, you're changing their chemical balance within their body as well. So we're exasperating the situation, and we're really treating a symptom instead of the underlying issue. So when we look at this as an aggregate, unfortunately, mending a broken society in a time of such uncertainty is no easy task. Creating more equity in insurance coverage and access to care, which is often improperly limited to symptom relief, as we already talked about, or crisis stabilization, rather than the treatment of important underlying problems. It's vital. But as much as expanding funding and access to mental health services are all a good start, one of the biggest challenges, it seems, is simply asking for help.
Yeah.
And I was one of them. So I think by and large, Americans are suffering from one of the more pervasive symptoms, which is denial.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's actually a very good segue point to your own personal story. You certainly were, as I described you in the title, a badass woman, joining the Marine Corps and, being a type A personality from what I know about your background. And as you just said, you needed help, but didn't want to ask for help because you were trying, I guess, to live up to your own self-concept and what you thought others would think if you asked for help. Could you please elaborate a bit on your own life and what led you to what could have led to a completely different ending to this story?
Yeah, Alan, it's a difficult story to tell, and probably an even more difficult story for others to sometimes understand. In a 3-year span of time, I tried to take my life 3 times, the final being the most violent, as you said earlier, by a gun. So on my 52nd birthday, after responding to my last Facebook message, I attempted to die by suicide by placing a loaded gun under my chin and pulling the trigger. Now, although riveting, it's not simply my story of unlikely survival of the physical event and overcoming the psychological impact of it. I think it's also the story of how I got to that point, how I got to that dark place in my life. And here's why I believe my story will resonate with others. So let's do a quick once upon a time. By all accounts, I was always a very normal and some would consider successful and driven individual. I skipped my senior year of high school and went to college at 16. Had my parents sign for me at 17 when I joined the Marines and turned 18 in boot camp. While I was in the Marines, I married another Marine, and we were together for 12 years and had 3 beautiful children. I was working also in nursing school at the time we divorced, and I believe our children were roughly about 8, 10, 11 years old. And as head of household, I could no longer be both a student because I was in clinical rotation at the hospital at that point, instead of being able to take an online class, as well as a mother and full-time breadwinner. And particularly that's when I was living in Southern California. So I dropped out of my nursing program. I later found myself in higher education professionally, this time instead of as a student. And over a span of time, I worked my way from being an entry-level admissions rep to manager to director to VP of enrollment management, overseeing 160 plus employees who were responsible for all new student recruitment and retention, and then later VP of corporate admissions, and I was overseeing 24 campuses spread throughout 11 states. So, you know, you and your listeners are probably thinking, hey, that sounds pretty damn good. What happened? How did she get to the point of wanting to take her life? And I think this is what really is significant about my story, because it really demonstrates how this could happen to anyone. I did not have any, and let me also say, I think it's why I believe it's also so essential I share my story, because there's such a stigma associated with mental health and suicide. People don't talk about it, and there's always an assumption that someone who has attempted suicide must have had an ongoing mental disorder, such as bipolar or schizophrenia or some of the other things. And so what I'm about to tell you with my story, it really does demonstrate how susceptible we all are to this happening and how it really could happen to anyone. So instead of having a previous history of mental illness, what I did, however, have was years of chronic stress, which lowered my resilience and the ability to bounce back over time. I just really never noticed it because while it was so pervasive in my life, the chronic stress, the decreasing resilience was so gradual, and it spanned well over 10 years. And in retrospect now, there were warning signs along the way that I was losing effective coping skills. Had I really known what to look for, and had I even paid attention? So let me elaborate, and I'll kind of show you what I mean. Let's look at the 3-year period of time surrounding the suicide event. Sure, I had some life events that were life-changing, but they didn't warrant me trying to end my life. Although there have been a lot of management and workplace culture issues with my employer, I had been in the same job for 3 years. On the personal side, although we had some challenges in our relationship with my partner, who is now my husband, because we both brought baggage from our former relationship. And, you know, I had been divorced for 17 years. So finding myself in a living relationship was a major change for me.
Right.
Yeah. However, when we look at that, again, that 3-year bubble, I was still in the relationship. So nothing major had transpired during that 3-year period of time. Yet, at the same point, overwhelming anxiety and sadness had consumed my inner dialogue. And over that period of 3 years that we're talking about, I attempted to take my life on 3 separate occasions. The first 2 instances, I cut my wrist, and then, as we've already talked about, we know about the third instance when I actually shot myself in the head. At that point, prior to that third attempt, I was fully aware that my mental state had progressed from situational depression to clinical depression. But I hid it, and I hid it very well. And what I've learned is that, in fact, that's one of the most dangerous aspects of being a highly functional depressive. A lot of people think that when someone's depressed, you know, that they sit in their room and they don't go out and they isolate themselves and they have no energy. But that's not what depression looks like for everyone. So for me, I was highly functional. I was still going to work. I was being very active. I was very productive at work. And so to George, my partner, it appeared I was powering through, I guess, and triumphing over my newly found mental illness by brute character alone. And after all, isn't that what we Marines do? Remember, suck it up and move on.
You're still being a U.S. Marine at that stage.
Well, and I come from a long lineage of Marines, so yes, you know, you encounter challenges, and you know, when it going gets tough, the tough get going is the motto.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
Right. So, my colleagues, of course, at work also had no idea of my crushed spirit or my suicide attempts, nor did my family or the few friends that I had in the area. So I think what's really important here is this 3-year period of time when the suicides took place. That really represents my implosion, but it doesn't yet explain how I got to that point. And I think this is what's so important for your audience. So let's zoom out a little bit more to 5 or 6 years surrounding the suicide, and maybe you'll be able to understand a little bit more. So I get canned from my university VP position in a coup d'etat and clash of wills. And don't you know, I bought my house in 2006 at the peak of the housing market. And
2 years,
yes,
2 years before another implosion, right? The economic implosion.
So I get canned in 2011 during the period of the housing market crash, which was still ongoing at that time. And so I was unable to sell my home, and I had really kind of overbought. I was making exceptionally good money and had overbought. And as a result, when I lost my job, I lost my house, and I lost all my savings in one fatal swoop. So during that 5-6 year period of time, I moved from Kansas City, Missouri to Northern Virginia to share my life with George, who you've heard me reference. He's the love of my life and my partner.
Right.
But what I failed to predict was the varying degrees in which my life would further change. So I had moved away from my adult children for the first time, and I missed them desperately. I also found myself in really unfamiliar territory. For the first time since my divorce, I was no longer making decisions based on what benefited me. Well, that may be hard for a lot of people to understand how that was so difficult for me. After 17 years of being alone and head of household with my children, I made decisions that were really based on the benefit for me and my children, and obviously my career advancement. So I found myself geographically restricted for the first time from a career standpoint, and it had a significant negative impact on my career. George had a great job and didn't want to leave Virginia, and I now found myself in a position where I was no longer able, or I suppose even willing, to take the best job offer and move wherever that opportunity presented itself, because now I was in a committed relationship. So I initially landed a good job in Washington, D.C., with roughly about half the salary that I used to make. As I talked about before, the downside was that 4 to 5 hour daily commute due to traffic.
That was a killer by man.
I'm telling you, road rage, my vocabulary increased.
Your vocabulary of 4-letter words increased a little bit, huh?
It really did.
That's when the F-bomb comes in very handy during the commute.
I learned words I didn't think I could ever learn. Right. So after a year and a half, the commute really just became intolerable for me. And I changed jobs to a local university, which resulted in a position with even less than half of the salary and former responsibilities I had worked so very hard to achieve before in higher education. So, as you can imagine, my ego was shot and I was just mentally exhausted, and I began to experience situational depression. Yeah. I felt as though I had lost both my personal and my professional identity. So I think you're starting to get the picture a little bit.
Yes, exactly.
But let's take it one step further. Let's zoom out just a little bit more. The reason why I had moved to Kansas City in the first place was because of Hurricane Katrina. I was working for a university outside of New Orleans when Katrina hit and destroyed not only the physical location of my employer, but also my home.
Wow.
So, whammy.
I was just, I was just getting ready to say, before I knew about Katrina, that what you said up to now was a perfect storm of events, both personally and professionally, that had kind of caved in on you, and then a literal storm. The Katrina one, I didn't know about that one. Wow.
That's a very good analogy, Alan, a way to put that. So, certain functions at the university temporarily relocated to Kansas City, Missouri, where our second campus was being built at the time. So instead of being able to really focus on my family during this time of trauma, I was more focused on rebuilding my admissions department and servicing our students. Because we were an online university, the location of our employees didn't matter because we were servicing students globally. So I had gone from 80 employees down to 10. And during that period of time, I had to recruit and train new employees and help rebuild the university. What was even more challenging, we had on one more layer of stress and challenges, was the fact that my pregnant daughter had just come home to live with me 2 to 3 weeks prior to the hurricane. Interestingly, ironically, sadly, the father of her child died by suicide when she was 8 months pregnant. So we were already dealing with some major emotional trauma before the hurricane hit.
Yeah.
Now, I share all this with you not so that you'll feel sorry for me, not at all. I tell it because instead I believe it helps normalize the conversation.
Yes.
And really important, in part, how important it is and critical it is to monitor your mental health, just like you would your blood pressure, blood glucose, get mammograms, etc. Left unchecked, unattended, and untreated, it can really evolve into something far more serious.
Yes.
And that's really how this story imparts to everyone. We are all at risk, irrespective of how strong we really think we are.
Right. Well, there's an old adage, I'm sure you've heard many times, what doesn't kill me improves me. I guess in your case, that almost became a literal test. But please elaborate a little bit on resilience, because obviously you somehow managed to make your way through all this and have now taken on an even larger cause, which is to be of assistance to others who are facing the same challenge. So what are some of the techniques one can use to develop a level of resilience? Because this is the most challenging time in the history of mankind with regard to dealing with life in the digital age. So talk a little bit about resilience and some of the techniques that you use in the coaching that you do and the speaking you do to organizations.
Sure. So maybe, let's talk about resilience for a moment first, because I think you hit on something that, oh boy, how do I want to go about this? How do I want to answer that? What doesn't kill me? I guess adversity, maybe the best way to approach this is adversity is a fact of life. When you have resilience, you harness inner strength that helps you rebound from a setback or a challenge, such as a job loss, an illness, a disaster, or the death of a loved one. Really, it's the ability to roll with the punches. And when stress, adversity, or trauma strikes, you still experience the ability to rebound. In this case, and I think, I'm getting a little tongue-tied, so let's talk about this for a second.
Okay.
You still have stress and adversity when trauma strikes. You still experience anger, grief, and pain, but you're able to keep functioning, both physically and psychologically. However, as I've learned, resilience isn't just about toughing it out, being stoic, or going it alone like I did. In fact, the ability to reach out to others for support is really a key component of being resilient. So if you lack resilience, you might dwell on problems, feel victimized, become overwhelmed, or turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms such as substance abuse. And that's something that you mentioned earlier. The good news is that there's growing evidence that the elements of resilience can be cultivated. So when developing your personal strategy to developing and building resilience, some ways you might want to consider would be, first and foremost, take care of yourself. I can't stress this enough. Tend to your own needs and feelings. It's important you participate in activities and hobbies you enjoy. Include physical activity in your daily routine, get plenty of sleep, eat a healthy diet, practice stress management and relaxation techniques, of which we'll discuss a little bit later, such as yoga. Yep, you know this very well as a yoga teacher yourself, and a huge advocate for yoga. They are so important. So yoga, meditation, guided imagery, deep breathing, or even prayer.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
so
I think you were just elaborating the 6 pillars of well-being are sleep, nutrition, yoga, meditation, social networks, and earthing, getting out in the sunshine and walking and so forth. So I think you were elaborating on all those. There is a metaphor which is the surfboard, and I think it's a good lead-in to the point you were making, which is that yoga and meditation and the other pillars of well-being don't eliminate the external events in your life that are stressing you, but they do provide you with a surfboard to more calmly surf the choppy seas and even some tsunamis we all have in our life. So I know that you are currently nearing completion of your yoga teaching certificate, and I think you've told me you use mindfulness already, at least the meditation part, with some of your work with clients. Could you elaborate a little bit using the surfboard metaphor on how important yoga and meditation are in dealing with all this?
Yeah, so I've never heard that metaphor before, but I love it. So yeah, I have found meditation to be an excellent tool to reduce stress and improve healthy living. But I think if we also get into the science behind it, it's really telling. So it's not just a personal story of how I have benefited from it. I think it's really important to stress the science behind it so everyone can see the real impact it has on their ability to handle stress. So first and foremost, meditation reduces activity in the brain's, what I call the me center. And one of the most important studies over the last few years was carried out by Yale University. And they found that mindfulness meditation decreases activity in the default mode network, DMN, which is the brain network responsible for mind wandering and self-referential thoughts. So, and I've heard you use this term before, monkey mind.
Yes.
Yeah, so since mind wandering is typically associated with mental unrest, ruminating, anxiety over potential past, present, or future, as well as depression over regretted past, present, or future, or even obsessionality, you can see why it would be helpful for many people to dial it down. And so studies have shown that meditation, through its quieting effect on that DMN, it appears to do just this. And even when the mind does start to wander, because of the new connections that form, meditators are better at snapping back out of it. But here's the thing that's really, I just recently learned this, and this is just really kind of cool to me. The effects of meditation actually rival antidepressants for depression and anxiety. So let me take a minute just to elaborate. A review study last year at Johns Hopkins looked at the relationship between mindfulness meditation and its ability to reduce symptoms of depression, anxiety, and pain. And they found that the effect size of meditation was moderate at 0.3. Now, to a lot of people, they're thinking, what is that? I don't know what that means. And it sounds low. But keep in mind that the effect size for antidepressants depressants is also 0.3, which makes the effect of meditation sound, pretty darn good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So it's.
I think the reason
Go ahead.
of that is I've actually got a section in the first book that I wrote entitled "Your Happiness Does Depend on Drugs, Just Not the Ones You Read About in the Newspaper." Meaning that we're all born with what I call a Walgreens or a CVS in our heads, God-given oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins, which a practice of meditation and yoga through the vagus nerve distribute from our brain all the way to our toes. And so when you wonder what you mentioned earlier, the science behind all this, and I'm glad you mentioned that because there is still a stereotype among some that this is all, woo-woo Eastern religion stuff. It's not that at all. This is science-backed ways to deal with resilience and the way to cope with stress and anxiety that we're all given at birth. And, the cortisol, you mentioned being chronically stressed earlier. When you're chronically and acutely stressed, your brain also has a drug called cortisol in it, which is good in terms of giving you a warning when something is endangering your safety. Like a woman walking through a parking lot at night with her purse, and she sees someone that looks threatening, and so her amygdala warns her with a good shot of cortisol, run to the car, get in, and lock the door. But when you're chronically and acutely stressed, that same vagus nerve that distributes the Walgreens in your brain, the good drugs, is also carpet bombing every organ in your body all the way to your toes with cortisol, which then creates all kinds of physical illness and so forth. So anyway, but the surfboard, I think, is a good way for people to look at the impact that yoga and meditation can have in your life in allowing you to more calmly surf the choppy seas. And we all have choppy seas these days to deal with.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to add.
I was going to say one last thing, to your point, meditation, yoga, it's not a magic bullet for depression, as no treatment is, but it certainly is one of the tools that may help manage symptoms.
In fact, I'm glad I was just going to ask you that same question. So I, nor you, nor anyone who is a strong yoga meditation aficionado is going to say that it's a cure-all for everything. So since you've got not only a lot of experience with dealing with acute and chronic stress and depression, but you've also studied now and are coaching others, is there a balance between these natural means, yoga, meditation, sleep, the 6 pillars of well-being I mentioned, and in more advanced cases, the real need for psychiatry and medication and so forth?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And yes, I absolutely believe there needs to be, for many people using their own resources and the kinds of help that we've, discussed may be sufficient for building resilience. At times, however, an individual might get stuck or have difficulty making progress on the road to resilience. And when that happens, a licensed mental health professional such as a psychologist can assist people in developing an appropriate strategy for moving forward. And I absolutely cannot stress how important it is to get professional help if you feel like you're unable to function or perform basic activities of daily living as a result of a traumatic or other stressful life experience. So I guess that being said, there are significant health benefits to complementing traditional therapies. such as medication and psychotherapy, with one or more of these techniques that we've talked about, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, you essentially create a double whammy that leads to a wide range of psychological and physical health benefits.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you so much. We could go on and on this most important, critical topic for our listeners and for all of us who are having to deal with life in the digital age, and it is the most stressful time of all. And I particularly want to thank you, DeAnn, for your willingness to not only be my guest and talk about this from a professional standpoint, but to share your personal story, because it's really the personal stories of people just like you that can really bring help to others who don't want to ask for help, don't want to admit they're having a hard time. And it is something that we all need to talk about. So Thank you very much, and thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in to Exiting the A.S.A.P. Lane. So we will see you next week, and thank you again.